So the state of Michigan insists, breathlessly insists, that the water there is okay. It's drinkable, it's passable. You can drink it, you can guzzle it down, and you'll be perfectly okay. It meets the standards that it is supposed to meet based on the EPA. People have been skeptical of this. I mean, after all, the government, the state of Michigan switched the water supply to the Michigan River, and in switching the water supply to the Michigan River, didn't treat it properly, and so it was, think of the water as being too acidic, and one of the plumbers mentioned, well, this plumber in the story that I'm going to talk about, but he made the point that specifically the Flint River wasn't treated properly with corrosive control chemicals. As a result, the water's pH were significantly off and acidic. It's like running a cleaner through the pipes that exposes all of the lead. Think of it as pulling the stuff out, and when people drink it, they're essentially drinking lead. The water wasn't treated. I guess that's what it boils down to. The water wasn't treated properly. And this ended up going into people's homes. Now, several people have been prosecuted for this, but the governor of the state, the person who said the buck stopped with him, the buck didn't stop with him at all because he hasn't been prosecuted. Now, the thing is, they keep saying that this water is straight, this water is drinkable. And they removed the water pods earlier in the year that they were giving out to people freely. Bombshell reporting by Jordan Chariton, formerly of TYT, now of Status Quo, makes the point that not so much. Dramatically not so much. Now, the way that they were able to get the lab results, the way they got them, essentially the way they were able to get the to test down low so they can run to the press and say, hey, look at this number. It's through a process called flushing. Essentially, by running the water before you take the test, you can dilute the amount of lead that's in it and get a dramatically different result. To give an example, in one case, and this is awesome reporting, I put it at the bottom. So just to be clear, and just to back up a little bit, the EPA lead level requires 15 parts per billion. Now, the 15 parts per billion is somewhat slightly arbitrary because there is no level of lead that's acceptable to the human body. All of it is toxic. Now, in the way they went about this, over the course of the last few years, they had what they call sentinel homes, 31 of them, at least by the reporting. Now, of the 31, 17 recounted flushing, arriving, essentially officials from the state that were supposed to be there to assist, arriving at their home, violating EPA standards, and flushing the water before running the tests, dramatically dropping the value. Now, let's see. Right here, I'll just read it. He's talking about a person. This particular person ends up with thyroid cancer. Not to mention her kids who are drinking this water were also adversely affected from the standpoint of behavioral issues. Jane's home was part of the Sentinel data pool, which was the official testing group of the home selected by state officials to continuously test in the years after Flint water crisis became a national scandal. Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the state repeatedly used Sentinel homes as its measuring stick to claim that Flint water's lead levels were improving and ultimately falling below the EPE's quote-unquote action level. Of the 31 homes, Sentinel homes, where the residents reported to status quo that the flushing occurred, 17 recounted MDEQ or core officials arriving at their homes and flushing before the samples themselves. The remaining 14 Sentinel homes residents told status quo that they flushed before the samples they took based on verbal instructions to do so provided to them by the MDEQ or core officials. Now, based on Michigan Department of Environmental Quality own standards, you're not supposed to do this. And the EPA is definitely against this. This was a violation of the EPA regulations. The EPA confirmed to status quo. Lead and copper tap samples used to determine compliance with the LCR must be collected as 1 liter first straw sample after the water has stood motionless in a plumbing system for at least 6 hours, an EPA spokesperson told status quo. But Michigan's testing violations weren't limited to improper flushing in the homes of status quo uncovered. The EPA said that the Michigan state personnel were not supposed to be sampling for residents for testing meant to comply with the EPA-led regulations. Meaning, not only were they flushing, not only were they not supposed to do that, not only were they not supposed to tell people to flush, but in some cases they went and did it themselves. Water systems leave the sample with the residents, and the residents collect the compliant samples. It is the residents that's supposed to do it, not Michigan. Michigan is the one that caused the problem. Michigan has every incentive of the world to try to sweep this under the rug, especially with the Republican governor. Because I've said it before, Republicans are not the most empathetic people in the world. And they did this with this idea of saving money at the expense of the people who are actually living in this city. The goal of this stuff, of clean water, should be clean water, not saving money. It should be clean water. And in this case, this story is amazing. Let's keep going. They weren't supposed to enter homes. Now, this has caused significant problems. So in some cases, the person who listed above, James, she has thyroid cancer. Is the thyroid cancer associated with the lead that she's been ingesting and been washing herself with? Potentially, yes. In another case, this woman miscarried. Niika Wakes, 42 years old, blames the lead-contaminated water for a miscarriage of twins in 2015, along with her 9-year-old son's severe misbehavior and her 19-year-old daughter's hair loss and reading comprehension problems. They are destroying lives. Full stop. Destroying lives. Wake's home serves as a good example of how MDEQ's flushing sample manipulated lead levels by artificially lowering them. MDEQ's flush test at her kitchen sink from February 2016 produced 2 parts per billion. When they flushed it, 2 parts per billion. When the EPA tested the water from the same sink 2 months later, without flushing, 85 parts per billion. That's a dramatic difference. And this is across the state, or across Flint. Erin Brockovich, Jordan even brought her into it, falsifying a federal and state regulatory compliance test that is a crime, she said. Brockovich also noted that, in light of these falsified tests, it is not possible, as has been by many media outlets, to claim thousands of other cities have higher water levels than Flint, since Flint real water lead level is now in question. Meaning, looking around the country and saying, many of these countries have a higher level of lead than Flint. I got to be honest, that's somewhat of it's, if the levels of lead are high in the various cities, then it doesn't really matter if it's higher than Flint. I think that's somewhat of a moot point. The point is, you have human beings that are ingesting lead, and you have a government that is somewhat ineffectual to do anything about it, or is trying to do things about it in a way that's trying to sweep it under the rug, and optics as opposed to actually fixing the issue. The point is to fix it. The point is to fix it. An EPA spokesperson told Status Quo that running the water right before collecting the sample could result in a change in the amount of metals in the sample, though this would depend on the plumbing materials in the home and whether or not the home is served with lead service line, as well as other factors. Meaning, depending upon the fixtures. You have some people who have old fixtures in a home that may have some kind of lead or some kind of corrosive material in it. I may be saying it's slightly inaccurate. May have some kind of metal in it. The water itself, being untreated, was essentially rubbing up against the materials, pulling those materials out into the water, meaning when the person turned on the faucet, they were drinking this particular material. And I guess the sentence just makes sense on its own. The materials in a home would dictate whether or not how much lead the individual gets. In light of the regulations prohibiting flushing and the EPA telling status quo Michigan state officials weren't supposed to be collecting sentinel samples themselves, status quo repeatedly asked the EPA if the agency had been aware of state officials were improperly entering homes of residents on the sentinel program and collecting samples. The agency didn't respond. Didn't respond. And I love this. Michigan's own sampling instruction video cautioned against flushing water before sampling. Let's see. Let's flip it so you can see it for yourself. Michigan's own sampling instruction video cautioned against flushing water before sampling. Remember, do not flush any water from the faucet before you take the sample. Written instructions provided to some residents also instructed to take the water sample right after turning the tap on following a 6-hour stagnation period. This article is rather long, but of course, Michigan denies this. Michigan says that the residents just got it wrong, that the residents were confused. And this excuse of confusion is what they're using to kind of paper over all of this. I don't think all of these people were confused. I mean, that would mean that each, like, you would have had multiple homes all throughout the city confused. Had them all confused. By the same token, the state has all the incentive in the world to say that. Right here. Dr. Sullivan, a mechanical engineer, professor of Kettering University in Flint, Michigan, was appointed by Flint Mayor Karen Weaver, a Flint Water Interagency Coordinating Committee, a committee created by Governor Snyder to bring together a wide array of experts for long-term solutions to the Flint water situation. Sullivan told Status Quo she had fielded complaints from residents about state officials entering their home and flushing their water before sampling. It's not the first time I've heard it. I've heard it from a lot of residents, Sullivan said regarding residents telling her that the water had been flushed before samples were taken. She added that she wasn't personally surprised that the group of individuals, state of Michigan officials, will violate testing regulations, but that the general public who depended on the state officials to ensure safety would be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised either. But yeah, I think people would be surprised. If this was my mom, for example, if this was my mom would take the perspective that, well, they're coming here with this idea of making sure that the water is safe, because clearly they have to do something about the water to make sure that the water is safe. I, her cynical son, would say they have every incentive in the world to not do that, and would not be shocked in the least that a Republican governor cared more about the optics. Like, it's hard to get across how gross this is. They full well understand that people are inhaling and drinking lead. But to them, it is more important to have the optics. It's a big deal. Let's keep going. Frederick Quincy Jones, a Flint resident whose home was also in the Sentinel program, knew something was wrong when the MDEQ and Corps officials ran his water for 3 minutes before sampling. A former Navy medic, one of Jones's responsibility was to make sure EPA regulations were met on board ship and other commands. And I'll end it on this one. I know they violated the process, of course, he told Status Quo. This was illegally done. The results were falsified. They had a problem of optics. And one more. Jones led officials improperly run his water for a little while before questioning why the sampling was being done this way. I knew better. I was going to see what they were going to do. I'm one of those types of citizens. I'm not stupid. So when you do pop questions, all of a sudden you get tight-lipped, or they get tight-lipped. And the longtime Flint resident thinks it's possible that improper testing was pervasive across the city. Why wouldn't it be? If it's that way in a few cases, why would it only be isolated to those few cases? Why? I wouldn't be surprised at all. He goes out of school. I wouldn't be surprised either. MDEQ denied our findings, of course, claiming that there were different types of tests and that the residents got it confused. But our investigation found this response to be highly doubtful. From the beginning of the crisis, state officials cited the Sentinel study as its official focus group of homes that Flint water lead levels would be measured by in relation to the EPA's lead regulations. There were indeed other forms of sampling conducted by the EPA in Flint, as well as outside universities. However, the latter were not official EPA regulatory compliance studies. The Sentinel homes, however, were used for EPA regulatory compliance, meaning these homes were the ones that were used to determine whether the EPA's lead compliance levels were of 15 parts per billion was met. I hope this is clear. This idea that there were multiple tests, the main tests and the main thing that was used to make the determination of whether the compliance was being met was the Sentinel studies. That was the benchmark. And if they were flushing in the Sentinel studies, then this idea of the media press or their getting across that compliance was being met or that things were improving was bogus. All of it is in question. They were monkeying around with the results. Let's see. And this is just a repeat of the previous. Governor Snyder suggested that status quo's findings might be indicative of residents being confused. I love that. All of these residents are completely confused that somebody comes into their house, flushes their water before taking a sample. All of them are utterly and entirely confused. Maybe it was all the lead that they were drinking. Maybe it was all the lead that they were drinking. Here's another one. So at this point, Jordan goes through and shows a history of manipulation of those results. So his findings weren't the first time that MDEQ had been shown to manipulate lead water sampling. In 2008, after Detroit lead sample came back at 115 parts per billion, an MDEQ official suggests collecting more samples and to bump this one out. That sounds nasty, to bump this one out. In 2015, MDEQ officials, in an effort to keep Flint average water lead level from raising eyebrows, instructed a Flint water utility worker to remove 2 high lead tests from his Flint lead water sampling report. And to avoid EPA scrutiny or intervention, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality lied to the EPA in 2015, claiming it had implemented the proper corrosion control in Flint's water supply after the switch to the Michigan River. Of course it hadn't, which is what caused toxic Flint water river to leach lead off of Flint's water distribution pipes and into the water. Wow. This is one of the residents. This resident was the one that was mentioned earlier in the report. This was the one that had thyroid cancer. She says, they don't know if this is, they don't know, it still hasn't been diagnosed. Essentially, she was told by a doctor that she has cancer. It started in her kidneys and spread to her thyroid. They don't know, it still hasn't been diagnosed. She said about the spot on her right kidney, which hasn't been biopsied yet because of her weak immune system, a complicated factor to the CT dye. And this is just further stuff that gets worse. So right here. In water sampling he conducted in Flint, Chariton is a plumber, if I'm not mistaken. Chariton, who was featured in NBC News and Rachel Maddow's 2016 coverage of the water crisis, explained that by running water even for 30 seconds to a minute or two before sampling, you're flushing lead out that could be sitting within a home's interior plumbing and fixtures, along with service lines coming from the yard to the home. That's a big problem because the fixtures themselves contain lead. A lot of older fixtures have a lot of lead in them, and if you flush them, you're going to get rid of that lead also, he said. In the water sampling he conducted in Flint, Chariton had found that a lot of the lead had resulted from the home's interior plumbing and fixtures coating. Coating meant to prevent lead from leaching into the water, being completely removed rather than simply corroding. This occurred because Flint River, which wasn't treated properly with the corrosion control chemicals, as a result, the water's pH level was significantly off and acidic. It's like running a cleaner through these pipes that exposes all of the lead. For further insight into the drastic effect flushing can have on lowering lead levels, in 2004, DC's water and sewage study is instructive. When the agency flushed water for 10 minutes before sampling, it eliminated 95% of the lead. A Washington Post article reported WASA tested 96 homes and lead levels over 300 parts per billion and found that after flushing for 10 minutes, the median level was 13 parts per billion. The highest number was 65 parts per billion. That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm going to put this here. Like I said, it's a long article, but it is somewhat instructive. Well, maybe instructive is the wrong word. I guess informative. The water is still not right in Flint. At some point as a society, you have to ask whether you want the government to work for the people of that particular country or whether you want it to work for the top 1%. And if that means potentially taxing the top 1%, or if that even means having government work for the government, meaning if the job, there is no situation where this should happen. None. None at all. Especially in this scenario where these guys intentionally and willfully, you could say, tried to hide the fact that it was taking place. I think the worst thing for me is, it's like the entire point of the process is to make sure that the water is right, because you have people drinking lead. And then they were monkeying around with the results in order to hide the fact that the people were drinking lead. The whole thing was sleazy from beginning to end. Bob Romero said, yes. Yes. And Snyder gets off. Snyder gets off. Moni G, we will and should be taking care of those people and their children for the rest of their lives. Yes. I live in Michigan, and by golly, my taxes will. But what about the criminals in office? Let's be very clear. I made point to the Republicans and said these are empathetic fucks. But Obama was president of the United States at this point. And I understand that this is a state, but I have to be honest. What does it look like if the president of the United States decides, I'm not going to let this take place, and use all the powers at his disposal to fix it? What does it look like? Now, I understand it will be usurping this from the governor itself, but it's usurping it from the governor in a sense that becomes somewhat of a national emergency. And the president just sits on his hands. This was under a Democratic administration, while in a Republican administration, the standpoint of governor. This looks horrendous. This is fucking horrendous. Snyder also imposed a pension tax to fund tax cuts for businesses. Democrats made noise, but did nothing, as usual. As usual. Oklahoma has led all over the place. You know, they did, if I am not mistaken, Chicago, same thing. Rahm Emanuel, under a Democrat. This is not just a Democrat or Republican issue. This is both. This is both. Brian Nelson. So who has tested their water for lead? It's happening in more places and nobody knows shit. Yes. I wouldn't be shocked. I wouldn't be surprised. We have an aging system. We have an aging system. And don't necessarily want to put the money into making sure that the system is up to date. Yes. Because Democrats are the same as Republicans on economics. Yes. Yes. I mean, there may be a modest incremental difference, but, you know, do you want to keep putting in the incrementalist that slides further and further to the right, one concentration camp less? I mean, for fuck's sake. Oh, no doubt, Jamal. Obama definitely should have stepped in. He's a terrible disappointment. Yes. Yes. Russian bot. 3,000 United States cities was the last figure I heard reported. That's amazing. But Russia, it's all Russia. Russia's doing it all. The problem here is Russia. You know, if you're in a situation like this, whether you're white or black, what do you think of your government at this point? What do you think of your government at this point? Are you angry? Are you pissed off? Your kid is sick. Your kid has been drinking lead water. Your kid has environmental difficulties. You've just had miscarriage. You have thyroid cancer. Somebody else is working 60 hours a week while simultaneously paying taxes for lead water. For fuck's sake. For fuck's sake. It's amazing. Good reporting by Jordan on this. Hands down. He wouldn't come on the show, so there's that. But whether he would come on to the show or not, the reporting was good. The story stands on its own. So I will leave it here. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the Patreon. Thanks all.